now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-futurism.
Welcome back. We are in the King Charles III space station. I'm Tom O.
And I'm Calum Drysdale.
And we are clinking our glasses of sherry. Cheers. Because it's a somewhat special episode, isn't it?
It is. This is now our 25th episode.
Which is one episode for every listener.
So this one goes out to you, our 25th listener.
Of whom perhaps even one or two might be female.
But I suppose, Tom, the podcast is now out of the range of dating Leonardo DiCaprio.
Alas, yeah. What if we get to 50?
Well, then Pierce Brosnan comes in.
We start again with the new series, of course.
Pierce Brosnan comes in and swoops in and swoops the podcast off its feet. But I suppose instead, between those two episodes, those 25 episodes, there is a chance for you as a single man to potentially to come in.
Well, you say that, but I was at the pub last night and I distinctly recall that this minxy brunette was fascinated by my talk about the British Antarctic Territory. It sounds like I'm lying, but let me show you what she WhatsApped me.
There is no greater shame, Tom, than bringing up the WhatsApp messages the night afterwards.
At 23:22, this young lady WhatsApped me saying, "The people's minds." At 23:23, she said, "GB Minerals." So we've got one fan of the British Antarctic Territory. Perhaps not my wife. But
well, beggars and choosers and all that, Tom. But I suppose potentially this is a lesson that actually, listeners, this goes out to you. If you are seeking to impress a young woman at the pub, you too could raise the prospect of the British Antarctic Territory and your future homestead together on the newly melted peninsula, cleared peninsula with, I don't know, what could they be doing? Like in Blade Runner, maybe protein farming or something.
Do they do moisture farming on Tatooine in Star Wars?
So if you want to raise the future Anakin Skywalker,
if you want to be like the Derek polisher.
You could be a moisture farmer. You could be a protein farmer. You could be a diamond collector.
Any kind of farming apart from actual farming, because nothing will grow in that barren soil.
A lichen farmer.
Yeah.
No, that's good. The British temperate rainforests, actually, which we will be talking about soon.
Have you watered the lichens this month, darling?
The lichens don't need watering. That's the benefit of farming them.
Yeah, trick question. Get out of the shelter. Get out of the geodesic dome.
Go and touch lichen, brother. You've been spending too much time on Twitter.
But there has been a recent highlight of our glorious 25 episode quarter of a century stint, which was involving Robert Jenrick, wasn't it?
Robert Jenrick, who has now...
Well, no. Calum, let us set the scene. So Calum, was this a Friday afternoon? Oh, no, it was a Monday.
It was a Monday
afternoon, and Calum was kicking back on a day off from the lab, donned his tweed, and went to a Westminster conference on nationalism.
Yes. I as a prominent nationalist influencer, my attendance was required at the Now in England conference.
So you strutted down to Now in England. You're in the audience with a bunch of tweedy nationalists fellow Tweedy nationalists.
There was actually fairly little Tweed on show, I'm afraid, Tom. It was far more chino-y or Zara suits than Tweed, I'm afraid.
Very disappointing.
Very disappointing. Scruton would not have fit in there. Although it was his memorial conference for him.
But but on pyramid stage was one Robert Jenrick, Bobby J. What was his speech about?
Well, he talked about a lot of things, but I think the central thrust was the need for a confident and muscular Britain and England specifically. So I think Aris Roussenos talks about this, right? That now that we are post-imperial, the idea of England is once again rearing its head. And you see this particularly right at the Epping protests or around, that people are waving the English flag, that Scottish and Welsh identity is fairly well settled, but English identity is now rearing its head. And he talked about the need for a confident, forward-looking England, particularly focused on things like tech and science. And he uttered the immortal words.
With lasers flashing from his eyes.
Garbed in crusader gear and singing Jerusalem, he said, I am what you would call an Anglo-futurist.
And the crowd went wild.
I
would say that a couple of group chats that I'm in went wild.
I don't think I can quite claim that they went wild. I think the response could probably better be described as chuckles, as the audience realised that this man, who will probably be the next leader of the Tory party, had been looking at the same Twitter posts that they had. But it was quite. I think what was notable was just how the audience knew what he was talking about.
Yeah,
we're not total no hopers, Tom.
Well, I perhaps it'd be incorrect to assume that this was a result of the podcast. I mean, there's something we're going to...
What do you mean? This is our disciple, our acolyte.
What, you're telling us Robert Jenrick doesn't have posters of us up in his bedroom of, us in the King Charles III space station?
I can only assume that he wears his Tom and Calum pajamas every night.
Well, and if he does, then if he does want those pajamas, then we can give him a discount.
Use our discount code Jenrick10.
Jenrick10. Yeah, I mean, probably the case against our little podcast on its 25th episode being incredibly influential is that there was a recent paper written partly on Anglo-futurism, and it didn't mention us.
Yes, exactly. So, potentially, despite the fact that we are now prominent figures in the Westminster sphere, Francesca Melhuish declined to mention us when talking about the dangerous and the sinister agenda of Anglo-futurism.
Yeah, so she first of all, we were trying to figure out where her name is from, and I thought Melhuish was a Scottish name, that perhaps she's a pixo-futurist, which is why she's been so cruel about us, Calum.
No. Of course, I recognised it immediately as a Devonian name. So actually, her problem is not with England, but with the Anglo-Saxons who displaced her Brythonic ancestors.
Well, apparently, Melhuish comes from the Old English pre-7th century. I actually did know how to pronounce some Old English because of my English literature degree, which has very few uses apart from this. But I've forgotten how you pronounce this particular word. But this is a fusion of two words, adding up to something like Melhuish, a brightly coloured hide of land, or a hide of land covered with flowers.
Unlike your name, Tom O, which is what people say when they see you and they go, oh.
Very, very rude. I mean, I did look this up in a dictionary of surnames, and it might well be, the family legend that's in like an ancient Cornish surname. So I don't want to detract from that family legend. The Oxford Dictionary of Surnames does suggest that it might in fact be an Anglo-Saxon word for hill. It's not as good as this brightly coloured hide of land. But Francesca brightly coloured hide of land. And we do want to be clear at this point that we would love to have her on the pods to discuss her paper. So we definitely don't want to be as mean to her as she has been to Anglo-futurism.
Well, although she, as she said, maybe the fact that she hasn't mentioned us is because she's actually secretly flirting with us. She's
got posters. She's got the pajamas as well. But her paper, which was in some journal or other, was a new Elizabethan age.
One of these academic rags.
One of the many to which we subscribe, and which we read cover to cover up here in the KC3 by the fire. But the paper was called A New Elizabethan Age, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, and I continue to quote, Nostalgic Politics of Anglo-futurism. So I was reclining in the Chesterfield in this half-timbered space pub.
Spitting out your cocoa.
And I hurled the journal into the portraits on the wall. And the précis of the article, or précis, I would say, is that ARIA, which we have nothing to do with, by the way,
as much as we would like to claim.
I did do a day of contracting for it in 2023.
There you go.
Which I remain very proud.
The conspiracy theorists can tie a red thread between the two pins.
But Francesca Melhuish from the University of Southampton has done a bit of digging into things that were said kind of in Parliament about ARIA around the time of its foundation, and she talked about how Dominic Cummings suggested, I think it was Steve Sue, to be CEO, and he's a scientist who I think has flirted with eugenics, and so she kind of cast aspersions on all of Anglo-futurism as a sort of proto-eugenic movement, not least because ARIA, much of ARIA's science doesn't involve committee, and she thought that was a bit dangerous.
Well, yeah, no, come on, let's be fair about this. The criticism is that by not going through a sort of considered process like that of, say, UKRI or the various research councils. I mean, I'm funded by the BBSRC. That money will be spent on dangerous goals and I think critically she is worried about these like great men, people who view themselves or think that history is shaped by huge characters. I mean, we're all familiar with the great man of history, and I think we would subscribe to that, wouldn't we? We would say that there are people who have, and Samo, right? Samo
Booyah, friend of the show,
would particularly, is the most obvious example. He would say, yes, there have been people more so than others who have changed the course of history, right? Like, a piece of microhistory is called microhistory because the role of a Florentine miller in the 7th century is probably less, revealing of the trajectory of history than, say, Napoleon.
And I think, I'm trying not to kind of mischaracterize the kind of lefty academic view, but it's probably fair to say that the academic orthodoxy at the moment is, well, two things. Great man history, the great man view of history is wrong, and also that even if it were true, it would be bad. And so academics favor kind of systemic explanations for why society changes.
Yeah, and I think there is a sort of interesting sleight of hand that is accomplished in a lot of these criticisms, which is that, you take figures like Putin, like Orban, like Trump or Bolsonaro, who potentially have maybe cast themselves as great men, and then you simply say, oh, well, they haven't achieved that much. Bolsonaro was ousted. Orban has been unable to reverse the sort of demographic decline, as in the like low birth rates. Putin has been unable to destroy the Ukrainians. And I think there's something sort of quite interesting there, which I think is potentially a fair criticism, which is a sort of, now that people are aware of the great man theory of history, everyone wants to be a great man.
Well, I think the great man theory of history was, I think, the prevailing view until probably this post-war period where it's become unfashionable.
Yeah, but
maybe now it's coming back.
But the problem of it, right, is that if everyone wants to be a great man, and your advertising copy needs to say, "Oh, this is one of the great men," you have this sort of like simulacra effect where everyone is trying to do the things that would make them a great man, i.e., if you show Trump a knot, the man will immediately draw a sword and slash through it. In that it's like it's play acting, right? And I think there is like quite an interesting criticism there of, can we? What does it mean for someone to be a great man or to do great man like things?
Well, this fashionable concept of agency.
Yeah.
Which loads of people, in like Silicon Valley circles and beyond talk about. It's like the concept is basically that, like, through your own will, you can change the direction of your life much more dramatically than people kind of think you can.
Yeah, you can just do things.
Exactly. You can just do that. And I think if you're part of this kind of liberal orthodoxy, then it's quite scary to think that these systems through which an elite has roughly had their way since the war might actually be vulnerable to, like, willful individuals.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's not an idea that is actually just limited to Silicon Valley. So there's a sort of trend or a meme, or I don't know what you'd call it, on TikTok, of remembering that you have free will. And then people will say, "Oh, I've just remembered I had free will," and then, for example, we'll go and take their coffee cup outside and we'll walk around, or we'll do something that might be unusual. And in many ways, I think there's like a common thread there, which is, and again, this is maybe actually coming off more of a kind of Marxist left-wing criticism, that that a capitalist system or a market economy forces you into like quite a narrow conception of what you can do. Reduces people to laborers in a fairly restricted range of possibilities, and that remembering that you can go and, I don't know, go to McDonald's, buy a burger, and then buy a Whopper, and then mix them together into one giant burger is something you can do. All of this is part of this sort of broader idea of actually, and again, people would probably, left-wing people probably call it kind of resistance to a hegemonic capitalist orthodoxy. But there seems to be some commonality there.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking this through. I suppose that the way we think about Britain's future basically has it that the current pathway is one of decline by default, and that Britain will have to act with agency if it is to get off that deterministic path to doom. And I suppose in that sense, we're certainly subscribers to, like, sort of, I don't know, something akin to the great man theory, whereby it should be possible to wrench ourselves off that track. And indeed, it's our only option.
Yeah, but again, actually, maybe the more appropriate thing is great founder theory, right? What Samo talks about.
Yeah, this is Samo's expression.
Because again, this is the criticism of reform, right? That because Farage sits atop the Reform Party and is basically unwilling to allow the branches to act independently, is unwilling to do a lot of the kind of traditional political process that Cunliffe, Philip Cunliffe talked about on our episode with him, that you need this body of small local boys. I mean, the little platoons, right? That Burke talks about, that you need small organizations at the local level that people can actually feel parts of, conservative associations, unions, church groups, whatever you want to call it, that Farage needs to somehow channel all of that in himself, and that's impossible, right? He at the moment does not have an institution or an infrastructure that will allow him to arrive in Downing Street and deliver the changes that he wants. Because I mean, you don't need to spend much time in kind of, I sort of horrified that I'm even saying this, but Westminster circles, going to like pub meetups or whatever, and you bump into people say, oh yeah, I work for the Labour Party, or I work for the Tory Party. There's just a vast amount of clever people there who are doing work that maybe it's not like aligned with what we would say is what's necessary for the country, but they're clever and they're working for a common goal. The Reform Party just doesn't have that, right? That he needs to somehow, that it's not enough having a single person. You need to have this infrastructure.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting projects underway to try to make things easier for the next government, whoever it might be. Like Fix Britain, which Munira Murta is helping run. So I think the idea is that they will help an incoming government with this plan to take control of the machinery of the state and actually get things done in a way that recent governments have been unable to. Not wholly unlike the spirit, at least, of Douglas Carswell's milestones plan, which again he talked about on the pod around earlier in the year. And this challenge is to, the theme is becoming clear to allow a government to actually have agency. I would actually really like to get Francesca Melhuish on the pod to talk about all this stuff. So if you're listening, please do get in touch.
Yeah, and I think particularly there's an article that she references called Thanatos Triumphant, which again I think is this very interesting example of that sleight of hand of, oh, there are people who call themselves great men of history, but they haven't achieved that much. And then this is sort of brought round into the argument that instead actually Anglo-futurism and this kind of, I would say, almost revivalist, capitalist moment that I think people are experiencing is, what David Edgerton, who is a historian who's written about kind of technology and innovation in Britain in the 20th century, and has tried to kind of debunk a lot of these myths that British manufacturing was in decline and that everything was downhill in the 20th century, would say that these are basically very shallow movements, that these are periods where an elite class who is feeling itself running out of road is now scrabbling around for references, for historical precedents, for some basis upon which to base its future legitimacy, because, as I said, the road is running out and now a crisis is coming. And it's interesting, right, that both sides seem to agree that like a breaking point is being reached. The question is just whether we are a continuation of that ancien regime or what is coming afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it seems a very malleable time. There was some polling data today that basically amounts to like almost half the adults in this country being in favor of some form of remigration. Which, I mean, there's not like longitudinal data on this, but it's pretty crazy. I mean, to put it pithily, I think a lot of people are very pissed off with the direction of the country.
Yeah, but although I do think a lot of it, and I think I'd be interested to know what you would say about this, because people talk about civil war, right? The David Betts essays raise the possibility of civil war. Like, do we genuinely believe that these protests outside hotels are the beginning or evidence of civil war? I don't think that. I don't think that it is that convincing to argue that these are sort of the beginnings of a militarized and militant movement.
No, I think I don't particularly subscribe to the idea that civil war is looming. I think it would be naive not to imagine that sectarianism and disorder will continue to increase if there are not fairly dramatic changes to policy. That's not really the same as civil war. We don't have a militarized society. In fact, like the demographics would suggest that we're going to become less prone to violent revolt as we continue to get older as a society. So I don't see civil war happening. But there's not to say that like Betts is wholly incorrect.
Well, and I think potentially what is more interesting is the fact that a whole load of people are talking about it, right? In that it is one, both a shibboleth, i.e., a whole load of people are coordinating based on this being true. And secondly, that the fact that people are even talking about it, what would once have been like totally verboten as like a topic in polite discourse, there are, it is a projection activity, right? It's people saying radical change is necessary, therefore we will even talk about civil war.
Well, I think people are worried that we'll end up, like South Africa or somewhere. I mean, Tom Jones, another interview of ours, wrote this whole piece, I think, for the Critic, imagining Britain turning into South Africa. And it in some ways, it's a difference of degree rather than kind, right? Like disorder just like gets worse and worse until eventually you want to live somewhere gated, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no. I suppose my objection is not that we are heading into a less sophisticated and less like civilized future. I think that is fairly indisputable. I suppose it's more that whether there is a genuine constituency of people who will be willing to oppose it. And I was having quite an interesting conversation in the pub today about what it would take for this conflict to emerge. And actually, one of the key elements for it was that the opposition mobilizes, right? Because at the moment, really, it's a question of largely sort of working class, lower middle class, and a few sort of professional people from local areas around these hotels. And the opposition has largely been against the police. The police are the target of the ire because they're the ones protecting this and keeping it going, right? It's a challenge against the state.
Well, don't forget that there have been like ostentatiously lots of women involved.
Yeah.
Doing conga lines and wearing pink and that kind of thing, and sitting around like holding signs saying like we're not far right.
Yeah. I mean, that I think, as I said, is.
But obviously they're protesting rather than like flinging bottles.
Yes, I suppose part of what I'm saying about the unlikeliness of civil war is that something will give way earlier, be that regime change or, as people have described it, some form of British colour revolution driven by, as you say, women-led, kind of uncontroversial protests.
Anyway, yes, but speaking of terrible things that could befall humanity, Calum, you are now contractually obliged, as a tenant of mine, to ask at least one question about my recently released book.
In order to carry out the agreed terms of my tenancy agreement, Tom. Now I'm being very rude.
Don't let me torture you like this.
I'm being very rude. Actually,
Calum's living with me for the summer, and it's wonderful. And we're playing cricket and eating pies and all this kind of thing that Francesca Melhuish would probably hate.
No. I should be less rude because Tom has written a rather wonderful book. I'm told I haven't read it. No. I'm being very unfair. I think it is. So Tom has written this book about the end of the world, and particularly about how there are people who are trying to avert it. And I think Tom has been up and down the length of the country, flogging it in Waterstones, on the radio, to anyone that would listen. And I mean, we've talked about this, and I think what is it potentially interesting for listeners is you wrote this, or you proposed this when you were something of a bit more of an EA.
Yeah, I
didn't you?
would definitely describe myself as an EA when I was a student.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of malaria-net era, when the effective altruists, for that is what an EA is, were very concerned. Well, like for anyone who is ignorant of what an EA is, EAs are animated by this question of what is the most good you can possibly do. And so effective altruists in those days, in the early 2010s, thought that the best thing we could do with our money was to try to cure neglected tropical diseases in the developing world and just bung money over there to deal with.
But why? Why, right? That's the key point for those who are unfamiliar with them. Like, what is the justification for that?
I would say, I mean, it depends on the EA, right? But I think most of them felt utilitarianism to be a very powerful moral framework. And people feel that kind of utils, to use this, a sort of hypothetical unit for welfare, are utils wherever they are. And so EAs are generally impartial about like which utils which utils they try to bring into existence. And then over the years that followed, I went off to be a journalist, and many of these EAs went off to work on what was then this burgeoning field of AI, which they felt could one day become quite dangerous. And EAs more broadly were interested in catastrophic risks, so like things that could kill lots of us, or even existential risks, i.e. things that could kill all of us. And I even did a bit of work in this field after I left the Telegraph in 2022, and that's kind of the origin of the book. I was like following the intellectual course of these people, and so that's where I had my journalistic I suppose, into some of these fields.
Yeah, and so the argument, right, is actually, if we're going to be intellectually honest about utils and the utility of humans, we shouldn't just think about people who are in our own family or in our own country, but rather the whole world, and even people who are unborn, right? That actually there will be far more humans.
Insects,
and you and I both were. Well, you were a vegan and I was a vegetarian.
Yeah.
Although I was not necessarily for EA reasons. And so yes, the existential risk and the end, or the fact that these people will not necessarily live ever or come into being, is then a far greater risk than any, I suppose is this fair enough to say that any short-term like decline in quality of life of people now can make up for, can be justified in order to improve people's lives further down the line, as in, or future humans.
Yeah, I think not all EA, it's not the case that all EAs have exactly the same views, but I think that's a fair characterization of long-termism, which is the school of thought within EA that was very concerned with existential risk, because the feeling was that if we were all to get wiped out now, that could cost us could cost our species this like huge future full of happiness, whose importance would like massively outweigh whatever's going on now.
And this was what drove you to write the book. And I
mean, it wasn't because I was interested in all this stuff. I think certainly by this point I would have wanted some journalistic distance between like myself and these ways of viewing the world. Like I was writing about this stuff as a journalist rather than like doing the book out of a desire to be an advocate. But certainly that, and I didn't just write about EAs, but certainly lots of the work on AI that's being done today has arisen from this kind of EA way of looking at the world.
And so what you talk about things like super volcanoes,
the natural risks, which are kind of asteroids, volcanoes, solar storms, and then the anthropogenic ones, which are the ones that humanity in its wisdom generates itself. So like nuclear weapons and engineered pandemics, and the more dangerous aspects of AI.
And I as your tenant and interlocutor and irritant, I and I know we've talked about this so on, but it's something that I keep like enjoying teasing you about and trying to bring out is in the time since you have written it. Do you think you have now changed your mind on it, or are there now positions that you hold differently? Because I've quite enjoyed, while knowing you, meeting friends of yours who you met during your EA times, who have either remained being EAs or have stopped being EAs and have often done so quite dramatically. So have kind of and are now have maintained that kind of intensity of purpose that being an EA brings, but now view the sort of utils as not the correct metric to be maximizing.
Oh yeah, well we know one friend. I'll kind of save her blushes by calling her Emma. And Emma was like a pretty hardcore EA and like actually on the scene in the way that I wasn't. And she's also a bit of a Teutonic ideology maximizer, to use a phrase. So she was very into kind of EA and certain parts of the lifestyle that would like read as very liberal. And then she sort of became based in essence, and is now much concerned with the direction of the West. And I would say that I've had a kind of much less intense version of that journey, whereby as I age, I feel a slightly quickened sense of the fragility of the good things that we have going on civilizationally, while also having this like slightly unsettling sense that progress is not deterministic. There's a trend among people like Sam Obuya, who we referred to earlier, talk about the kind of the growing evidence that there were pretty advanced pre-industrial societies around the world, and for whatever reason, most of them just conk out. And not only do they conk out, it's often very hard to find any remains. Sometimes we do a kind of LiDAR scan of the Amazon, and we might find some remains of what might have been quite an interesting pre-industrial society, and they're gone. And I think a lesson from that and from things like the Anti-Catastrophe mechanism, which is a bit of amazing Greek machinery discovered, like the bottom some ocean bed. Which is
this is the one that no one knows actually what it was doing, but it was sort of extraordinarily complicated gears and things. Isn't
it was some mechanism for predicting the motion of the stars. And it was, as you say,
oh really? People do know what it is.
But the point is that like the Greeks didn't use it to like industrialize or anything like that. It was like a curio. And then that level of engineering was just forgotten for centuries. And that kind of thing just kind of gives me the willies, Calum, because it suggests that things are quite fragile. Maybe we've kind of reached some stage of civilization whereby we've passed some kind of inverted great filter, and we'll be fine from here on in. But I think it's probably prudent to feel some level of caution about changing things too fast or being reckless or losing sight of whatever secret source it was that got us from everyone living in kind of agrarian poverty to today.
Yeah, I think I'd agree, and I think that is the sort of idea that seems to animate a lot of people that I meet, and I think, I mean, you and I both, right, in that the sense that these wonderful things that we have around us are far more fragile than we dare to consider, and that over the last kind of 80 years, they have been, taken for granted. I mean, actually, I would go further. I would say probably back to a good, probably post-Napoleonic War, I would probably say. So in the, Lord Liverpool and that period were probably the last people who were really focused on British interests. Maybe, Palmerston gives a good line in it, but that you have people who have just assumed that Britain, and at that point, right, the empire, would carry on. And if anything, that should be the greatest example of just how rapidly a great society or a powerful society and a culture can just vanish.
Well, yeah, it's very, it's part of this kind of relocation of my concern away from X risk and towards Anglo-futurism is partly informed by this evidence that we see every day now of how we are in this post-imperial decline. And you see disorder constantly in London. Like actually on the tube last night, I was getting out at Brixton, and there was some roadman who kind of bumped the gate as usual, and I just happened to be walking past the guard, so I was like, dude, didn't you see that? Like he's watching, he didn't do anything, and he was just kind of just quite weary of the whole situation, and he said that he'd like there to be kind of police doing the intervening. There's never any police, so he says that happens like every couple of minutes. Some roadman just like goes through the gate, and that the best thing that I could do as a commuter who's just so tired of it is to write to the mayor and say like, please introduce some police. But unfortunately, like, we don't have the tax revenue to have police at every station, and that's partly because we just don't have like the birth rate to sustain it. So it feels like kind of every year of having a low birth rate and kind of high electricity prices and a kind of concomitant failure to make progress economically is another year in which it gets harder and harder to maybe even to be in that kind of like steady state, if it's possible, of just like remaining at your current level of progress.
And I think this is maybe actually a point where Francesca is right in that, what fuels us, right, is nostalgia. And I think she would probably regard it as a dangerous idea that we are nostalgic for wealth and prosperity that
Cuff me.
Yeah, exactly. Wealth and prosperity that existed during imperial days. And I suppose, and again, trying to be honest to her criticism, she would say that arose through exploitation. Not everyone had it. And that we are better off now, I suppose would be. Do you think that's fair? Have I missed anything?
I like, I think, I think typically right-wing people are probably better at modeling the minds of left-wing people than left-wing people are right-wing people. So, Francesca will have to correct us.
Sure. Yeah. Well, she can come on the podcast and tell us how we're wrong. But I think to me that feels like a fairly reasonable modeling. And I think there is truth in that, but I think potentially what she misses in that is that the Industrial Revolution, for example, and the vast progress of the 20th century and the 19th century and maybe, and even the 18th century, was what made the current prosperity possible, in that we should not think about absolute level, but instead should think about the first derivative of growth, i.e., how fast are things improving and changing, and that these, this world that we currently live in now is the product of difficult decisions and a world that kind of, and you talk about a great filter, right? That civilizations have to go through a process of kind of a challenge or a difficult step to emerge. Can they bridge that jump or jump that gap to a higher level? And we went through it with the Industrial Revolution, but actually people talk about it with the Fermi paradox, i.e., why are there not more intergalactic civilizations? And maybe there is some civilizational hurdle that no one has been able to overcome. And to me, it seems to me that we are potentially hitting that hurdle now, which is we're unable to keep that sense of progress and that first derivative going because we've got tired and we're just unwilling to keep doing the difficult thing and instead want to kind of chew the cud and eat the fat of these earlier people's work. So I suppose our nostalgia, again, it's not for the wealth. We're wealthier now. It's for the energy to keep going and to do more. Which I don't think is nostalgia, right? It is an attitude or a boldness or a willingness to defer, reward until later. Which to me is sort of so common among the people I meet, but is seemingly hated by other people.
I think maybe it's time for a kind of steel manning of what might in us be called nostalgia. I would call it wanting a future that feels like home. So this is why we thatch our space station. It's possible that humanity will be launched into this kind of future that is impersonal and extractive, particularly one where big tech has its way,
which is a very left-wing concern, right? It's, much of the criticism of Elon Musk, for example, or a lot of dystopian sci-fi is, oh, you're out in the corporate space station and you have to pay money for oxygen.
It's not wholly unlike the you will eat the bugs model of the future. It's like if you say a billionaire will be feeding you the bugs, then suddenly that's like a left-wing or a dystopia that the left might think of and fear. So I think in that sense, Anglo-futurism,
I think we take a huge amount from the left.
But particularly in avoiding these. Imagine if the whatever AI algorithm dominates the world is basically the Facebook algorithm, where the whole idea is that you are a resource to be mined. And you have this kind of experience that you don't share with anyone. You are just hooked on your particular part of the algorithm that's designed to inflame you and
the infinite blowjob, the infinite blowjob machine, right?
The infinite blowjob machine, is that what they call it?
Well, yeah. It's the that. I mean, it's a criticism of the EA or the utilitarian view.
Oh,
right?
I see. I see. Yeah.
Let's pump everyone full of heroin, give them the infinite blowjob machine, strap a VR headset on them, and that's happiness.
Yeah. I mean, the eternal Instagram reels of top 10 Arsenal goals 2015, 2016. Well, teasers are being fed into my mouth in this juddering fashion.
I like that would be your model. I think what would it be for me? I think it would probably be a succession of bizarre Korean videos about fermenting things to make Korean paste.
No. We want a very short-term dopamine hit.
No.
Stop showing off about your
I love
cooking.
that. I absolutely love that stuff. I saw something about fermenting soybean paste to make some Korean sauce or something, and I found myself thinking, God, I suppose I could convert my chest of drawers to I could fill it with straw and I could put these soybean patties in there.
Speaking as your landlord, I'd actually be quite in favour of you doing this.
Well, you have had my pies. You have benefited from some of my more ridiculous
the thing you made last night was wonderful.
There you go. That would be that. I suppose potentially the joy would cease if I could never actually make the things. But
what I did have to do earlier this evening, Calum, was to take your kind of vast, the remnants of your vast Mrs. Beeton pie out of the fridge, where it had grown this furry epidermis of mold. Unfortunately, because our cricketing teammates had not eaten it.
They hadn't eaten it. Neither had they eaten my...
Which I think is a great injustice, because it was a wonderful pie.
Yeah, neither had they eaten my potato and Gruyere croquettes. Though they did eat the Scotch eggs, the fennel, and what was it? Fennel and... I don't remember. Fennel Scotch eggs. I suppose I think actually I myself have got rather bored of pies myself. For a period I was wrapping anything I could find in hot water crust pastry, but even I have grown rather tired.
Calum wept. He had no more pies to bake.
So I think I'm going to have to transition into
a new medium. Before we wrap up, would you like some good news?
Go on, Tom.
A Scottish company has become the first UK-based rocket firm to receive a space launch license.
Wait, as in there wasn't one at all before. What happened? What was they doing at Saxe-Ford?
This is Saxe-Ford. I mean, I don't think very much. I think it was maybe a German company.
Was it not Virgin Space?
No, that was in Cornwall.
Oh, okay.
Where they had this like single launch. So now there are a bunch of spaceports, but you know, you can identify a site for a spaceport. That's not the same as having regular launches, and regular launches are not the same as kind of like a homegrown British company. But this is a kind of vertical launch company, and they're going to you know, launch suborbital rockets and do experiments. It's not the same as like a big kind of SpaceX jobby, which Peter Haig from episode 2 would love to see in this country. But it's a nice bit of kind of modest progress that would not have been out of place in the US in the early noughties, I would say. So that's quite good. And there's some news from Antarctica as well. There was another paper which argued that because of the kind of rate of heating that the world is undergoing, some glaciers in Antarctica will be melted, and that will release some of the pressure, this like titanic mass of ice that's been pressing down on volcanoes. And so if that glacier ice melts, then these volcanoes will be exposed. And previously they've been prevented from exploding by the weight of this ice. So they span this as bad news. But what it means for kind of hardy Anglo-futurists is that the mineral resources under the volcanoes might become more accessible. So you know, there's I was speaking to some geologist a couple of years ago who said there are tens of billions of dollars of precious metals underneath every volcano because the metals get brought to the planetary surface by these currents of magmatic heat. So given that, as I understand it, there are some volcanoes in the British Antarctic Territory, this is more good news for this, you know, great man infused theory of the British future.
Actually, I want to quickly touch on this, which is, I think, an interesting thing that happens on the right, which is even though people are willing to slightly poo-poo the idea that climate change is the worst thing in the world, i.e., you know, I look forward to having my British-grown pineapples, thank you very much. There is a total horror at the idea of putting kind of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to slow it down, which I think is an interesting, that you deny the significance or importance of carbon dioxide, but you're willing to posit that, you know, do-gooder maniacs will release sulfur dioxide and then screw up the entire ecosystem. I mean, what it actually seems to be is a fairly clear-cut case of, you know, when you put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, things heat up. And as we knew, right, from COVID, when with the ending of container ships using sulfur-containing fuels, when you stop producing sulfur dioxide, you lose the kind of cooling effect of it, and the temperature jumps.
Well, I can let me summarize the science because this is actually in my book. The sulfur particles in the upper atmosphere reflect sunlight back into space. That's pretty much it. And so this happens when there's like a volcanic winter or perhaps a nuclear winter. And the theory is that like if you put some sulfur dioxide in some big rubbery balloon with some helium and you send it up to I can't remember which part. Is it the troposphere? I can't remember. But you know, quite high up, not LEO. It's not, you know, we could see the balloons from where we are here in low Earth orbit. But they were popped beneath us, and so release this gas. It reflects light back into space, and the planet cools slightly. And so,
which is what happened, right? That's all the failed harvests around the fall of Constantinople and the great ice fairs, right, were caused by these big volcanic eruptions that caused like a degree or two of cooling around the world.
Yeah, it happens when Tambora went off in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
And the legend is that Mary Shelley, in this kind of gloomy summer that never was, which caused famine, spent most of it indoors writing Frankenstein. So it has this legacy.
But also, right, the fall of Constantinople has been linked to it, because harvest failed. So
Famine, rioting.
yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, question for you, Calum: is stratospheric aerosol injection Anglo-futurist? Note that Aria, who I think would not define as Anglo-futurism, probably never heard of Anglo-futurism, are funding some exploratory work on this method of injecting sulfur. Is it Anglo-futurist? The great man theory of the environment.
Yeah, I would say it is, and although my hesitation comes from my simultaneous dislike of the kind of the arrogant progressive who thinks that they have totally understood the system and thus can change it as they will. I mean, I've just written this article for Asimov Press about sanitation reform, and Edwin Chadwick has become my total enemy and nemesis. The man has been dead for nearly 200 years, but it doesn't stop him being my great enemy. Which is then balanced out, I think, by the sort of boldness and the excitement of the possibility of understanding that now potentially we can understand it and we can help undo and some of the effects of kind of greenhouse gas emission, and actually avert the damages or the problems of industrialization, and actually render the planet pretty stable ecologically and environmentally going forward. So I would say it is right and proper for us to research this and to engineer the planet. I think it is an incredibly exciting and bold goal, and I think we should celebrate the people doing it.
How much buy-in do you think we would need from the rest of the world to start this project?
Well, I mean, there's a risk, right, that you don't need buy-in, and there's a paper by, his name's Andrew Lockley, who talks about here it is, Andrew Lockley, who talks about the legitimacy and justifiability of non-state geoengineering, and that actually it would be quite simple for a private actor to start sending up these balloons.
Oh, it's happening. They're called Make Sunsets.
Well,
they're these kind of maverick jackasses. You could send them $20 like right now, and eventually they'll turn that into a balloon.
And then the other one, of course, is dumping iron filings into the ocean. Are you familiar with this one?
No, I don't think so.
So this is the idea that one of the big limiting factors for marine growth is the lack of iron. So if you look at the kind of seabed, there is a layer of iron ore that can be found, and that happened because when there's no oxygen, iron is able to dissolve in water, and then as oxygen levels rose with the emergence of life, that all falls out of solution and drops to the seabed. And that then stops a lot of, I can't remember if it's algae or plankton growth, but the argument is if you drop iron filings into the ocean, you get massive blooms of marine life, which then soak up a whole load of carbon, and then they drop to the floor, and you basically lock carbon into the sea. And it seems to have worked, and there was one experiment done, I think, off California, or definitely off the west coast of America. And kind of a year or two later, they had the biggest salmon harvest that they've ever had, because you've got this massive, huge amount of marine life that then the salmon ate. And when they then came to spawn, there were far more of them. But yeah, it doesn't take much. It really doesn't take much. And I, as you say, people are doing it, and they won't stop doing it. And I can't really imagine a world where you have governments who are willing to say, no, we're not going to try and stop the effects of climate change. To me, that seems, the environmentalists have always worried that this was a moral hazard, right? That it would prevent people from recycling. I think the
well, I'm not dealing with the real effects of air pollution.
Yes. Well, or the real effects of not being a communist country, right?
Yeah. It's not very conducive to degrowth.
Exactly. Your strategy of saving the planet pales in comparison to mine, which is
just stop living a post-agrarian life.
Exactly. Become communists and live in a mud hut. But I think I am quite excited by it, and I think it is a bold and exciting idea, which I suppose is probably a dangerous one, isn't it? I mean, it is for that reason that people worry about the ideas that we're professing, because it's scary. It is scary, but I think it is bold and exciting, and the people doing it are doing it with good intentions and are being incredibly serious about it. And I think that counts for a lot.
Speaking of, should we give the listeners a preview of what's coming up in the next few episodes?
Go on then.
Well, we are hoping to have the CEO of the British operation of a very large and important and exciting company. We've been guilty on this podcast of crowing before and things blowing up in our faces, as they did with the Chagos Islands, which we thought we had saved a couple of months ago. So I won't say who I'm talking about, but we're excited. We have agreed to do an interview with the CEO of Space Solar, who are a British company who want to beam solar power directly down to Earth.
And they have told us very, very explicitly that it will not be able to cook a chicken on the way down.
So that's why Calum has stopped cooking pies, because he won't have them roasted by the space laser. So rest assured, we have some fun podcasts lined up for you for the summer holidays.
Well, is there anything that we think people should read, Tom? We always ask our guests that. Well, actually, given that we are currently in a competition to see who can read most.
We are in a competition to see who can read the most this summer. I'm looking at the shelves and wondering which of those books I actually want to discuss on the podcast.
Well, no, I'm planning on doing an episode about temperate rainforests and a spiritual revival of Britain. So that's my contribution.
Oh yeah, we're gonna go and camp. We're gonna go and camp somewhere in the countryside and go and see a temperate rainforest
and potentially even do a magic ritual.
And we could bring a pie.
There might. Don't worry, I'm going to cater it well.
Well, Calum, I can't wait.
Well, thank you all for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we will be back in a week or two.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.